from an undisclosed location in the Great Western Desert in the land of the free and autonomous Native American people. The 2024 presidential campaign in the next time to return all US land back to their right owners. This is the Ben Zion Podcast.
I woke up from a dream which had Albert Einstein in it. Never met Albert Einstein, or even alive in the same decades. That's kind of the power of mass media and popular imagination that have this dream, I suppose. And it made me want to do this recording and talk about this scientific socialist figure. He wrote a book called Why Socialism. He was a Marxist-Leninist. And I'm going to read the most famous quote from that. He was a Marxist-Leninist, and it's maybe whitewashing to say, even just refer to this as scientific socialism, because those words, both of those two words in that phrase, have been turned into something largely unmeaningful by this the various fascist sympathetic institutions of our world. And some of these things are what I'm going to talk about in the course of this conversation. I go by the nom de guerre, Ben Zion, and that's meant to suggest. Maybe it would have been better if I had chose an alphanumeric nom de guerre, or a nom de guerre of another language that I'm less familiar with, another suggestive of another tradition outside of the Judeo-Christian mythos. That probably would have been better, but I don't have that understanding. There's no alphanumeric mythos. There are other mythos, but they perhaps wouldn't have engaged with people in quite the same way. So I chose this name, Yohanan Ben Zion, to suggest a voice crying in the wilderness for a techno-utopian outcome of a particular kind. This is called the Techno-Communism Show, and I try to articulate those ideas on a regular basis. I suggest you watch some other shows. So the point being, I've never engaged in a significant, durable way with the form of God belief known as Judaism. I was not raised in a tradition of this God belief known as Judaism, and that's really all I think that you should say on the subject. If you say much more, too much more than that, you're engaging in a kind of this settler colonial mythos, eugenics, in a word, eugenic ideology. This is a form of God belief. That is the extent to which these ideas are meaningful. Albert Einstein would be pretty embarrassed by the state of world Jewry today. I would think there's almost no chance that he wouldn't be. Albert Einstein was famously offered the first prime ministership that was taken by a much more fascistic person named Ben Gurion. He was famously offered this first prime ministership of this Israeli state, which had already been located illegally in Palestine at that time, which is more or less the reason why he did not accept that offer. But fast forward these 70 odd years to 2000, to September of 2023, you have Jews in this world living in one of two highly fascistic countries, and they are highly fascistic countries. So you have all but of the 10 million plus Jews in the world, all but maybe 200,000 of them living in one of these two settler colonial imperial fascist countries, and that's pretty bad. You can say it's a little dumb to imagine that the Jews have this outsized role in the Western fascist empire, the U.S. Evil empire specifically. That's this quote anti-Semitism play to imagine that, because you can track all of the millions of dollars have gone the other direction. Many billions of dollars have gone the other direction in cementing this abomination, Israel, as a military client state of this greater abomination, the United States. And you can track in history the Western fascists, not specifically from the U.S., other European fascists, as they plot and scheme to create this iconic settler colonial state that's disrupted the world. And this is all that Western fascists have done, is disrupted and killed. And you can see even the color of this in this one word, like so many others, anti-Semitism. I said, quote, anti-Semitism. It's not because that doesn't describe a real problem that has caused the death of millions of people, but because, look at this word itself. It's weaponized, effectively. It's used in one of many, many tactics to uphold the settler European people. It's used to defend European people from people who are critical of these settlers, or themselves stand in opposition to the settlers. So it's used against actual Semitic people to defend the people who some of whom are Semitic, but overwhelmingly we're really talking about Europeans. And so that's the sickness of the larger world, right? That's a sickness of the very kind of thing where I would have a weird dream about Einstein, not knowing him, because I've seen all of these little Andy Warhol style spots on MTV my whole life, not of Albert Einstein talking about what he actually believed, but of sticking his thing on doing something funny, or writing on a board E equals MC squared. He also wrote on a board the hammer and sickle. You're not gonna have a dream about that. I have a dream about him writing E equals MC squared to see people wearing dumb T-shirts with these things, bastardizing everything they actually believed and stood for. I'll read a quote, the most famous of quotes from Why Socialism. If you would recommend, I think, one book to people about Marxist-Leninism, there's an awful lot of theory that should be read and recommended, but this is perhaps the best book because this character occupies the popular imagination in such a way, and there's people have this intentionally willful blind spot to actually talking about who he truly was. So this is from Why Socialism, the most famous quote. He's writing right in the middle of the 20th century. Capitalism as it exists today, in my opinion, is the real source of evils. I'm convinced there is only one way to eliminate capitalism's grave evils, namely through the establishment of a socialist economy. A socialist economy. In such an economy, the means of production are owned by society and are utilized in a planned fashion. A planned economy, which adjusts production to the needs of the community, would distribute the work to be done among all those able to work and would guarantee a livelihood to every man, woman, and child. The education of the individual, in addition to promoting his own innate abilities, would attempt to develop in him a sense of responsibility for his fellow man in place of the glorification of power and success in our present society. And, this suggests one of the other more coherent quotes about Einstein. So when Einstein died, there was a bizarre fixation on the part of this settler colonial pseudo-scientific cult with his brain. His brain was so Albert Einstein was obviously an intelligent person. His brain was not different than anyone else's brain. He had the benefit of a certain kind of upbringing. He had the benefit of many years of special preoccupation with the study of physics that allowed him to come to some insights that others did not come to. This is, and to say much else, than this about this person's brain, which was taken from his head and practically used in sideshow fashion, is to engage with the eugenic type of thinking that unfortunately is supplanted in the public imagination his real views. So Stephen Jay Gould, another person, a serious thinker along these lines, said of his brain, "I am somehow less interested in the weight and convolutions of Einstein's brain than in the near certainty that people of equal talent have lived and died in cotton fields and sweatshops." It's an absolute statement of fact, an absolute certainty that this is the case. And this is this central problem is alluded to in Einstein's quote from moments before. And that's why in the fascist-dominated West, in the fascist U.S., you don't have things like a housing authority, a public health service, or job guarantees that would include a living wage and other protections, because in the absence of those things, you can dehumanize people to such a degree that you can create this unequal society and not bring out those inherent talents in all of humankind. You have people living on the edge of a knife, living with the wolf at the door, and that creates forces upon us an unequal society. And for all the bad that the United States does to its own people today, which is an overtly racist set of strategies to not include those things, because overwhelmingly the 70% of people who do not in the United States receive a living wage, and the overwhelming number of people who are negatively impacted by not having a housing authority and public health service, there's a highly disproportionate percentage of black and brown bodies, Fanon's term, black and brown folks who are going to have the wolf at the door a good deal more than those people who had more of a benefit of the kind of institutions alluded to, who were not subject to redlining tracking in schools overtly racist, and all of the things that have created this highly successful apartheid state known as the U.S., which passes itself off in the public imagination as something else. It focuses on individualism, and so the sham ideas of individualism, and so is able to obfuscate all of the violence done to these people. So much violence. So you can say of the UK, it's a major partner in crime in this sphere of influence that I refer to as the fascist West. A lot of people refer to as the fascist West. You can say of them that they've killed 100 million people in modern history, in recent centuries, causing the death of many tens and tens and tens of millions in India alone by creating conditions for a, quote, famine. This is a genocidal act, not a famine. And the United States has done things at least as evil throughout its history. It's not possible. It's easier to calculate the number of people that have been murdered by the British than it is by the, quote, Americans. The number is too large. So we can say in living memory, the number is at least 40 million. You can add up all the people that were killed, murdered for wanting to have a humane and sustainable economic system in their own country, in places like, just to name a few of the worst, the Korean Peninsula, the Vietnamese Peninsula. You really should read the Jakarta Method by Vincent Bevins, because it just describes, it gives receipts for how this has been done. A million people just died on that one island, murdered by fascist U.S. forces, effectively, manipulated into being murdered by fascist U.S. forces. You can calculate how many people died in recent years, in recent decades, because of the fascist U.S. You can't even calculate when factoring in the genocidal actions against African Americans and Native Americans that the U.S. has done, and part of that is also that you can't tease out the U.S. The proto-U.S. of earlier centuries, colonial times, so to speak, and the fascist West overall. But also, it's extremely difficult to know the exact number of people. Brown folks that existed in this hemisphere before the so-called pre-Columbian exchange, and the number of them that were slaughtered or otherwise done violence to or subjected to biological warfare in the course of those centuries. It's also difficult to know how many people have been died in this middle so-called this what's known as the Middle Passage. That's why we can't say how many people have been murdered by the United States, but it's a big number. And somehow, going back to this theme, and somehow all of world Jews essentially have ended up in one of these two fascist countries that do nothing else but uphold this settler colonial modalities, and they have fallen into this white nationalist stupor. You shouldn't even really use the word white to describe this. It's self-engaging in this eugenic set of ideas. You should really use European American and settler colonialism. Describes this as what it is, nationalism, and not in a pseudo-scientific language of eugenics. And there's no such thing as a white person. Okay, the idea is moronic. And just casually using this is moronic. How do I know there's no such thing as a white person? Well, there's a country that has well over 1 billion people, called China. About 1 billion of them or more are very, very light-skinned people with effectively little to no melanin. Right? Why are these people, where there's 20 times more people with little to no melanin than any so-called white country, why are these people not referred to as white? Because whiteness is a concept that only exists for doing violence to black and brown bodies. And almost every aspect of Western culture has been designed and upheld falsely to uphold that violence and this systems of elitism and cruelty that have emerged around it. This criticism of anti-Semitism should not be seen as a view about a religious thing or one specific ethnic group. It should be seen as just falling under this umbrella of larger set of problems of European American settler colonialist fascist ideologies and institutions, and it's pretty unfortunate. It's pretty unfortunate that people are so gullible that they I think in these terms. It's pretty unfortunate that the only way to begin to engage with that is to do a thing and to not have an alphanumeric designation, but to engage in to some degree in this with this kind of language. So you could say of this talk, this sounds all like problems. What are the solutions? And that's a valid criticism of anything, I think. Can go overboard. I think I mentioned that everyone should read this book, Why Socialism by Einstein. And everyone, if you're not prepared to, you should become prepared to engage as much as possible with a Marxist-Leninist theory. You can listen to audiobooks of all the major works of Marxist-Leninist theory. You can go to the Socialism for All YouTube channel and find almost all of these major works in audiobook form. There's a lot of other YouTube channels that you can listen to for free without any advertisements, unlike most other garbage on YouTube. Major works of Marxist-Leninism. So you should be listening to all the major works of Karl Marx. Yeah, the capitalism is long. You should still be listening or reading the works of Marx and Engels, Lenin and Stalin, and I recommended and many others, of course. I recommended this book, Why Socialism by Albert Einstein, just because there's one thing you can say to people that will cut through their brainwashing, so to speak. It is pointing to this deified figure and pointing out what he truly believed, and pointing out what is wrong with this world where we don't uphold and believe this, to the point where this planet is dying, right? The race that we know as humankind will cease to exist in maybe 30 years because of not adhering to these principles and allowing violent psychopaths, mostly centered in the United States, to do otherwise. That's what I said of read a book like the Jakarta Method, because it describes in no uncertain terms. It's not overwhelmingly a book supportive of existing socialism. It glosses over or describes Stalin as the bad guy, effectively, this State Department friendly narrative, and not someone who is responding to living in this hell world of the fascist West. The moment this Soviet Union came into existence, the fascist United States, even in these early years of the 20th century, attempted to, people don't even know this anymore, attempted to invade it, right? So the fascist West immediately, all of its other problems of this time, Second World War going on, all of these other problems of economic depression, still the fascist West was like, this is not suitable. We can't have the abolition of private wealth. We can't have the undermining of these fascist byways. We have to wipe this thing off the face of the earth. And that's all that need really be said of a Soviet Union history, is that every bad thing that happened there or under the Soviet sphere of influence was because of living in this imperfect world run by elitist psychopaths. So I recommend some other books that might open your eyes in the way that the Jakarta Method might. One of those is also available. You can listen to the whole thing online. It's very, very rare that something that's not well known, that's not entered the public consciousness, you could not, if you wanted to, find an audiobook version for free, or even just simply type the words into YouTube and listen to it there. You can speed it up, right? Maybe you don't want to listen to 15 hours at a time of talking about Marxist capital. You can speed it up to 1.5 speed, have it on while you're doing something else. But for these major works, you should absolutely read or listen to them. It's not so different one from the other, but you can do some other work while you're listening to audiobooks like this. So other works that might open your eyes, I think, is Settlers by Jay Sakai. And a lot of Marxists, they say this book basically is positing it's Maoist third worldist concern trolling of legitimate socialists, because it's essentially, in a few words, positing that it's not possible for settler colonists, quote, white people, to be socialists in the United States because of all of this these fascist institutions that they uphold and all of this fascist sympathetic baggage that they have, which is absolutely the case. And the book itself is largely just comprised of just accounts that are true from labor history and related areas across this continent across these centuries. That's almost all that this book is. And so to say that it's doing an unkindness to socialists, and it does basically describe some labor leaders who may arguably have done some good work as just genocidal settlers, European American racist and fascist settler colonialists. Okay, so but that's reality, right? And that's the point of saying this thing about Judaism existing only in these two countries. But you don't have a lot of control over the accident of your birth. I didn't ask to be born, for one silly example, in this fascist, the heart of the fascist West. Either, and in spite of myself, and wanting to say some little thing about these problems, taking a nom de guerre, that it would have been better to have an alphanumeric designation than to have this thing that's suggestive of this Judeo-Christian mythos, but working in a rigged game and to some degree violating the very principles that you're hoping to uphold. So you might say the same thing of Israelis or U.S. Jews. They didn't ask to be born, and the influence that U.S. Jews have is 1% of North American population on this monstrosity of $1 trillion a year fascist military-industrial complex and other institutions is small, right? It's an anti-Semitic trope to really focus too much on even though we're talking about wealthy people with more influence than the average global citizen, it's pretty silly to describe. It's silly to describe Israel controlling the U.S. and not vice versa when you can look at those receipts. But the point is that we have a responsibility to stand against these fascist institutions now more than ever on a dying planet. We have just a few short years before the planet will become so hot that we will then be in capitalist climate apocalypse. This is death spiral. Billions will die. It will be very, very bad. We'll be a time of cannibalism and mayhem and violence. I don't think that using the word cannibalism there is being too facetious when you really look at what's unfolding and what will continue to unfold. Even if it unfolds in slow motion, that's still genocidal action on the part of the fascist West, killing billions in the global South to uphold these systems. So, the point is Israel is a fascist state. The United States is a fascist state. More than anyone else, European settlers, particularly the main line of European settlers, it's not entirely fair to focus on people who have engaged with this small number of people who engage with this form of God belief, known as Judaism. But this is kind of a bunch of tricks to uphold the settler colonial. There's a fixation on very real Holocaust murders is a fixation on the settler colonist because just one individual who seized control of the Congo, King Leopold, these Belgian monarchs, killed more people in a genocide than were killed by Hitler in the Second World War. And just as you said, it's not possible to calculate the number of people murdered by the United States. The number of people murdered in this way is grossly underestimated, is grossly diminished in the public consciousness. And all of this is a feature of this European American nationalism that's able to pass itself off as other things. So your responsibility, and more, there's less of an onus on Native people and descendants of African slaves to change these systems than there is on WASPs, European Americans, to change these systems. So you would say that there's slightly less of an onus on Jewish people in the United States than, but the distinction is not that meaningful. The meaningful statement is that if you want to live, you need to rise up against the fascist United States, and you need to reject the various silly narratives, to varying degrees silly, but very, very silly narratives that uphold this fascist system.